Hello, and welcome to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. Today, we are honored to have with us a fantastic set of guests who will be speaking on this panel, and we can't wait to hear from them. But first, given the topic of today's panel, before we begin, it is especially important to acknowledge that we're meeting on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabeg territory. The sovereignty of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg peoples was recognized in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Their right to this land was never surrendered, but instead was stolen by colonial capitalist forces, the Canadian bourgeois state, its legislative and judiciary branches, and its terrorist apparatus, the military, RCMP, police departments, and prison systems. Indigenous land theft continues to this day unchecked, and with increasing violence and intensity. We demand the right of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, as well as all Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada and across the world, to the self-determination of their nations, and respect for national sovereignty. As anti-imperialists, we must always struggle for the victory of Indigenous rights and self-determination as part of our political work. And as for us, the Anti-Imperialist Alliance was formed by those of us here in Ottawa who feel great urgency about the worsening international situation and who are working to build a strong coalition against the tides of war, militarism, and neo-fascism brought on by the crisis and decay of US and global monopoly capitalism. As recent developments show, COVID is far from over in much of the world, and yet not only have Western countries dragged their feet on a potential vaccine intellectual property waiver, they've hoarded them in quantities sufficient for several rounds of inoculation for their own citizens, all while rejecting any voluntary transfer of vaccine-related technology in order to help overcome supply constraints. How does this dependence relate to the rampant inequality and underdeveloped public health infrastructure, which render countries in the global South especially vulnerable to dangerous variants like Delta and possibly Omicron? How do we understand the global pandemic as an outcome of historic and ongoing colonial relations between North and South? And most importantly, what is to be done about it? We'll be discussing all this and more with our guests. With us today, we have K.M. Gopakumar. Gopa is a senior researcher and legal advisor at the Third World Network, or TWN, and is based in New Delhi, India, although currently he's joining us from Geneva. TWN is an independent, not-for-profit organization that carries out policy research and advocacy on issues around trade and development with a focus on third world countries. His work at the Third World Network focuses on the global intellectual property regime and its implications for development. And next, we have joining with us Vijay Prashad, who's an Indian historian and journalist. He's the director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Research, chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and the chief editor of Leftward Books. He's published 30 books, including most recently Washington Bullets, with a preface by Evo Morales, and previously the 2-volume History of the World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. He's also a recipient of the 2009 Muzaffar Ahmed Memorial Prize. And lastly, we have joining with us Dr. Agustín Dávila. Dr. Dávila is a doctor and immunologist. He's a member of the Advising Committee of Investigations in Health in the Pan American Health Organizations and coordinator of the National Program of Reduction of Cancer Mortality. He also serves as the director of the Center of Molecular Immunology in Cuba. Unfortunately, Dr. Dávila is not able to be with us here live, as US sanctions make it extremely difficult to connect via Zoom from Cuba. Instead, he generously provided us with a video of his remarks on how Cuba successfully combated the virus in spite of these US sanctions. And we'll play this video towards the end of the panel. Before we begin, I'd just like to let our attendees know that if you'd like to ask our panelists questions during the audience Q&A section, you'd be able to submit your questions at any time, including now, via the Q&A button, which I believe should be at the bottom of your screen. Now, to kick us off, we're gonna turn to Gopa, and I'd like to ask, the COVID-19 vaccine distribution and access in the world has been profoundly unequal. There are countries producing the vaccine that do not have access to them. In a public health crisis of this scale, why and how is this the case? Who are the beneficiaries of this system, would you say?
Yeah, thank you, Samir. So beginning of the pandemic, WHO, I think within 2 weeks of the global lockdown, WHO organized an event to launch something called CTAP, that is a platform where all the COVID-related product can be openly licensed. but till date, there is only one license through that mechanism. So, but on the launch of that platform, which was initiated with the letter from the president of Costa Rica, that day, many world leaders, including Macron and Angela Merkel, declared that if we have if at all we are going to have a vaccine, then that vaccine will be a global public good, and it will not be a luxury, but it will be given to every people. So basically, a public good means it should be available, with an affordable price to everyone who is required for that product. But of late, what we have seen is that there is a hoarding of vaccines, okay, and complete neglecting the WHO resolution, which is adopted by all these countries. In 2020, World Health Assembly resolution followed a resolution from the UN General Assembly to ensure equitable access. This resolution basically mandated WHO to develop a global allocation mechanism for vaccine. That means every WHO member is supposed to follow that. According to that mechanism, there is a particular formula to allocate, prioritize the vaccination. So they basically identified 20% of the population globally will be vaccinated first. These are considered as priority population, that is senior citizens, frontline workers, plus people with comorbidities. But this global mechanism was global allocation mechanism was finalized around August 2020. Well before that, all the developed countries started hoarding vaccines, and it went up to a stage where Canada had at one point of time to vaccinate around 10 times more than what is required. It's 10 times of their population. This much was the degree of or the range of hoarding happened. So the mechanism collapsed. So basically, the developing countries or the third world were left to follow that mechanism because they were supposed to get the vaccine from something called COVAX, a failed facility as of today. This is what happened. So if you look at the current vaccination, everybody says there are around 7.8 billion people in the world got at least one dose of vaccination. But if you look at the data, around 10 countries account for around 5.7 billion of that doses, which definitely includes China, India, Pakistan, Mexico. But rest of it's are developed countries. And if you look at the vaccine production, the latest prediction is that end of this year, that's in 1 month's time, we will have around 11.5 billion doses production cumulatively. Out of that, around 6.5 billion is produced by two countries, 5 billion by China and 1.5 billion by Indian companies, or two companies from India. So that means with all the talk they have done, the production of this vaccine was concentrated in a few countries. And there is a reason for that. The Chinese vaccine and the Indian vaccine, of course, the Chinese vaccine has a old platform technology. It has its own limitations to production. Still, it reached around 5 billion doses, right? The best technology as of now, which has the potential to scale up the production, is actually mRNA technology. But this is mainly these mRNA vaccines were, used mainly in Europe and US. Around 70% of, or more than 60% of the vaccine people vaccinated in these countries used, were using actually mRNA vaccine. So that means the latest technologies or the technologies with the potential to scale up the production were denied. First point. And what's the reason for this denial? They said that it's if you disseminate this technology in an open manufacturing platform, or if you provide this technology to various other potential manufacturers, this will disincentivize the innovation. But who finance this innovation? These are all public money. Around 93% of the total, around 97 billion R&D, 93 billion went to finance vaccine. 93% went to finance vaccine technology. These are all public money. And there was complete de-risking happened. The government provided the money to finance the R&D, and government also gave the money to scale up the production. So there was complete de-risking happened. Still, the companies are not ready to give that technology. And the government who spent the money is allowing these companies to enjoy the monopoly. So here is the problem where we all told it should be publicly financed R&D, publicly financed health products. Of course, it is publicly financed, but the government is now aligning with the private companies and protecting their interests rather than the people's health. And it also, in a way, challenges the most, mostly cited reason for the protection of intellectual property. They always say it is the recouping of the R&D. You need intellectual property protection. You have to provide a limited period of monopoly so the investor can recoup the R&D investment. But where is the recoupment? It is completely financed by the government. And now, now they want to have a cake and eat too. So this is the problem. And how do they maintain this mechanism? These mechanisms are, well orchestrated mechanism. They uses three set of tools to maintain the monopoly. One, of course, is intellectual property rights. I will come back to that a bit later. Second is the regulatory mechanism. The regulatory mechanism. So if you produce a small molecule like a paracetamol, any company who produces the paracetamol need not prove the safety and efficacy of that paracetamol, because the originator company already provided all data to prove the safety and efficacy. But that's not the way the vaccines or other biotherapeutics are regulated. Here, every company who copy that technology, if they are not getting that technology from the originator, has the burden of proving safety and efficacy. So how do you prove the safety and efficacy? Through a clinical trial. That is costly and time consuming. So this, in a way, acts as an disincentive to reverse engineer the technology, because you have tweaked the regulatory system in favor of you. How much this regulatory system is based on evidence, scientists questions that, but this is the system. And second, and then the third tool is actually whenever there is a global crisis, we say WHO pre-qualified products should be used because quality is very important. But the quality system is picked, favoring a few big companies. So basically, to get into a small companies in Cuba or in many other countries, even countries like South Africa, they cannot pre-qualify their products. Therefore, they cannot supply these products through a WHO global mechanism. So Bangladesh is a classic example. Bangladesh has the capability to produce small molecules. They can produce the, say, remdesivir. The first generic version in the world was introduced in Bangladesh. Or prior to that, there is a huge, the world was facing something like hepatitis C crisis. Bangladesh came out with the first generic version. But unfortunately, those companies cannot pre-qualify. So they cannot supply to those countries who are depending upon the supply from the WHO. So the systems are tweaked in favor of big companies. So this is the way the dominance or the monopoly is maintained. And lastly, I'm ending it by saying there is also a network effect also. Network effect in the sense, people like Vijay Prashad can easily connect that transnational capitalism and all. You can link it wherever, which theoretical perspective we look at it. But factually speaking, these vaccine companies are also in, there is a network called Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Association. So it sounds nice, right? Developing country, like third world network, like you have Developing Country Manufacturers Association. But this is curated by Gavi. So the market is in a way divided. The high value vaccines are produced by multinational companies, and of late they give when there is a need for high volume, they hand it over these technologies to these companies. So they serve and they reinforces the status quo. As a result, these companies in developing countries also speak the language of transnational corporations. This is not the 60s or 70s where the companies speak for self-reliance and the national market. No, not anymore. So that is also one way of or process they use to control. So let me stop it here. Come back later.
Thank you so much, Gopa. That's a lot to think about, and I think it's a super important point you bring up about like why the idea of a public good, despite being so popular, kind of has no seeming legs in terms of bringing about the kind of policy changes people want to see. I guess in terms of our next question for you, we were wondering that how some observers have noticed that are been asked why countries like India and South Africa are they're looking for a vaccine like waiver or patent waiver when they have domestic solutions like compulsory licensing and other domestic legal flexibilities that they can draw upon yet have not used. Could you elaborate on why this is the case and like what's the result of this, or what causes this inconsistency?
Sure. So that takes me to to the earlier issue which I was talking about, the regulatory system. The vaccine regulatory system is in such a way tweaked in favor of the big companies. Okay. So before that, globally, we should also understand that who finally sets this global regulatory regime for vaccines or even small molecules or pharmaceuticals in general. Everybody thinks that it's WHO. It is not true, actually. It is a set of people, basically the three manufacturing associations of US, Europe, and Japan. That is the pharmaceutical manufacturing association of big companies, basically transnational companies. They call themselves as research and manufacturing companies, those who are having the ability to introduce new products, plus three regulatory agencies of US, Europe, and Japan. They sets the basic rule, and they have big say in the setting the rule, and WHO basically import those foods. Okay, so this is the way its mechanism is working. So as a result of all these things, what I told you earlier, you have to prove the safety and efficacy of vaccines and biotherapeutics, especially monoclonal antibodies, and all the vaccines. You have to prove safety and efficacy until and unless the WHO develops something called immunogenicity correlation protection. So that's that gets developed after many years of the introduction of the vaccine. So now the question is that why the regulatory point of departure is that any deviation from the manufacturing process of the originator company will have implications on safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So non-originator companies cannot exactly follow the manufacturing process of the originator companies because that is kept as a trade secret. But for us, they tell you this is the regulatory requirement to protect the safety and efficacy. Actually, it is an intellectual property issue because it is kept as a trade secret. So that's why the waiver is required, because compulsory license is, we talk about compulsory license, and compulsory licensing mechanisms are centered around patents. So you can issue a compulsory. What is compulsory license? Compulsory license is a legal permission to use that patented technology. That can be done. But then you come across when a company which is not obtaining that technology, manufacturing process from the originator company, then you have to repeat the clinical trials. That is time consuming. So the compulsory licensing mechanism get redundant or of not becoming ineffective because of the regulatory mechanism. But regulatory mechanism is actually an IP enforcement mechanism rather than a mechanism to ensure quality and safety of the medicine. Right? It's functioning like that, right? So as a result, therefore, you need a waiver. How waiver is going to operate? Because as I told you, compulsory license is around patent. Definitely, the compulsory licensing can give a freedom of operation related to the patents, but you cannot solve the issue of the regulatory barrier created through the existing regulatory framework. So the best way is that this manufacturing process is submitted with the regulatory agencies through a dossier. So that dossier is with the regulatory agencies. So the regulatory agency should ideally hand over this dossier to a potential manufacturer, so they can easily follow the manufacturing process and do away with the clinical trial requirement. So for this to happen, you have to clarify the trade secret protections norms in the TRIPS agreement. So you need a waiver for that. So that's why we require waiver. And there are two more reasons about compulsory license. Compulsory license, whenever developing countries used, they were put under tremendous political pressure, bilateral political pressure from EU and US. US always produces something called Special 301 report. Many times, many developing countries were put into the category of watch list, priority watch list, because of only one reason: they invoke compulsory license. But last 2021 Special 301 report, makes a departure, and it says that every country should use compulsory license. So this is a double standard. Actually, even EU was opposing use of compulsory license. And lastly, you are talking about compulsory license when a patent is granted. So many times these COVID vaccines are concerned, many patents are not granted. Okay, they are in the form of applications and pending in either in the WIPO PCT system or at the National Patent Office. So you may not able to grant a compulsory license because you don't know what kind of technologies are there. And lastly, in an innovation system, the innovators would be able to use, freely use various potential technologies to develop various products, right? But if there is an IP protection or a threat of or a potential application is pending, which may not be a patent per se, but a patent application, then that innovator would be reluctant to use that technology, because end of the day, some product is developed and then it results in some kind of patent infringement or any other claims from the IP owners. So that's a problem. That way the IP creates a chilling effect on innovation too. So all these reasons are to be kept in mind when we criticize the waiver proposal. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much. That I guess really demonstrates the complexity of this issue and how there's a lot of work that involved from a lot of actors in order to kind of push this waiver forward. Moving on now, we want to turn to our other panelist, Vijay Prashad. And to kick things off, we'd like to ask you, how does the present intellectual property law regime connect to the history of imperialism? And how does it reinforce imperialism in the present neoliberal kind of context of the last couple decades?
Well, Samir, thanks to you and Shivangi and others. Anti-Imperialist Alliance, tremendous name. Great to be with you. I've had a very long day. I spent the whole day doing a class on China, and that was very instructive because we were looking at the contradictions for a country like China between the two ethics of confronting your national ethic, your national interests. You got to take care of people in your own country, and then the much more complicated ethic of socialist internationalism, much more complicated ethic. And I was presenting a little bit on the fact that I'd met these Chinese doctors in Morocco many years ago, and I was surprised to see them. In fact, in the train, it was a train to Rabat, I said to them, "What are you doing here?" A group of Chinese doctors. You expect to see Cuban doctors, but what are you doing here? Well, they said, "We've come to spend 3 years. We're spending 3 years here. We are women's health specialists." And they were working in the southern region near the border with Western Sahara. I felt this is socialist internationalism. It's the antidote to imperialism in a way. And I wanted to start there because people need a little cheering up. Remember the Cuban doctors from the Henry Reeve Brigade, my friend Jani, who's working in a hot ward in Belize City, left her young child to go to Belize because she believes that she must bring socialist internationalism, that ethic, into the world, and Jani is there in a hot ward, very dangerous situation. And I spent a lot of time talking to her, asking, "How does it feel, Jani?" And she was like, "I feel strong. I feel that We and the other 2,000 odd doctors of the Henry Reed Brigade, we're bringing something effective into the world. This is the opposite of the question you asked me. And I wanted to start there, because why always let imperialism dictate the terms of how we should feel? I am a socialist international. I don't believe that imperialism must set my terms, right? So here we go. Look, when has intellectual property not been an imperialist, game? In 1883, the Paris Convention was signed. 15 countries came to Paris. Okay. Now, yes, there was Ecuador and there was Tunisia and there was El Salvador. But let me tell you, the three Latin American countries came on board the US ship. They were dependencies of the US. They voted with the US in the Paris Convention. Tunisia was a French colony. It voted with the French. The Paris Convention, which runs from 1883 to around 100 years or over 100 years, is essentially already an imperialist tool to freeze intellectual property of different kinds to the advantage of the imperialist core, and to impose then technologies which we are supposed to buy. Now remember, even things like quinine, the medicine that cures, that prevents malaria, was not something that the British discovered. They seized it from the indigenous people of the Amazon, brought it to Kew Gardens, of course, tampered with it a little, but the technology was already out there. There's a lot of technology that came under the so-called protection of the Paris Convention of 1883 that had been stolen from people outside, including the indigenous people of the Amazon. So we need to understand intellectual property law was always pretty imperialist in its story. Now, it is also true that after the formation of the new states, after the Bandung Conference of 1955, the Non-Aligned Conference in Belgrade 61, these countries fought to create the UN Conference on Trade and Development and the Intellectual Property Organization at the UN. And they fought to create space for themselves. They fought to create the passage of what Gopa was talking about earlier when he talked about, reverse engineering. In other words, they fought through the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and through UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. They fought to say that if you've created a drug, let's say, a paracetamol, we're going to take this drug and we're going to study it and we're going to reverse engineer, because what could be patented was the process, not the product. That means reverse engineering was possible. At the Punta del Este round of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, GATT, in 1986, in September 1986, the advanced countries put on the table revision of the patent law. It was called TRIPS. I remember hearing about this from my dear friend who died this year, Chakravarti Raghavan. Raghavan wrote a lot of stuff saying, hey, listen, something terrible is happening at the GATT meetings. They're going to change the patent situation. What they did was they were arguing, instead of process patenting, to have product patenting. That means you can't actually reverse engineer. Even if you reverse engineer, you have to pay rent to the patent holder. Well, immediately, India and Brazil actually took leadership in this, assembled a group called the Group of 10. I remember this because this was some of the early stuff I got very deeply involved in with the Delhi Science Forum, with my other great friend Amit Sengupta, who died a few years ago, was a tremendously influential figure. The Delhi Science Forum was doing a lot of research, and Gopa probably remembers this work at the DSF, did a lot of research trying to unpack the question of how the Group of 10 countries, and this included most of the developing countries that had some confidence. Remember, this is 1986, okay? Samir, this is after the debt crisis. Most countries had lost the confidence to challenge the West. The new international economic order passed in 1974 in the UN, that had been crushed. The debt crisis basically put these countries into a real situation of dependency. Real, I mean political dependency, not in a structural sense, political dependency. So it took something for 10 countries to get together and created the G10. And they tried to advance an agenda to block this change in patent law, and they failed. And this patent law, TRIPS, entered the WTO. You see, the World Trade Organization is the culmination of the Uruguay round of GATT. The Uruguay round of GATT's agreements entered to become essentially the charter of the World Trade Organization. And, even though countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, these three in particular, have really tried to fight against particularly the question of patents in pharmaceuticals. The AIDS question was at the table. I remember this at the Cancun meeting of ministers, where India, Brazil, South Africa created a bloc called IBSA, which becomes eventually BRICS. That IBSA bloc tried to put forward, and they used interesting mechanisms. Brazil saying it's an emergency, so we can, reflect on our constitution. But they were all worried about what Gopa talked about, which is the US government has a gun at the head of every country called 301. And what they do in their 301 list can really impact your ability to function. India is a major producer of syringes. If the US decides to sanction all those companies, these companies can produce syringes, but they don't know what to do with them. They don't have the mechanism. They don't have the confidence to make independent mechanisms. They're reliant upon multinational corporations. They become exactly what Gopa said. They become basically standing in the queue. They begin to think like the multinational Western firms and so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, look, yes, patent laws have a deeply rooted history in the history of imperialism, and they've got worse, not better. But they've been struggled against, not because the government in India is a progressive government, okay? Narendra Modi is a neo-fascist. That's an appalling government. But the contradictions of the world system prevent even a right-wing government from operating 100% as basically the adjutant of international capital. Because it's a right-wing government, it's a heartless government. But on the other hand, they can't afford to see hundreds of millions of Indians die in COVID-19. There's a limit to what is possible. And we've seen this with the mass struggle of farmers. Modi is not one to surrender. In 7 years, he's only twice backed down. Once around the amendment to the Land Acquisition Act in 2015, and now he's totally backed down, or at least he says he's backed down. What I'm trying to say is that there are contradictions in the world system, and these contradictions prevent it. We have to fight on the contradictions. We have to fight not just for COVID-19 vaccines. I mean, look, what Gopa said is correct. There's no question that mRNA apparently is a big breakthrough, not only for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for delivery of all kinds of medications. Moderna should not have the right to patent mRNA, messenger RNA technology. That should be available because it might have an impact on other kinds of medical problems, not just COVID. And so we need to insist on that. We have to fight for that. We can't just complain. We have to work with the coalitions that exist that talk about vaccine apartheid. But actually, under all that, we have to fight to end the patent law, the kind of the legacy of Punta del Este. We have to stand up and say that, what the G10 was saying was correct. What that old man, Mr. Chakravarti Raghavan, the great lion, was saying was correct. No more to this patent apartheid.
Wow, thank you. That was a wide-ranging journey, and I think really got the point across that there's a role for all of us to play, and that we're dealing very clearly with structures of colonialism that have not gone anywhere. Our second question for you sort of, I guess, ties more to the kind of contemporary aspect of this, specifically, and one that's kind of affected this panel. How have economic sanctions exacerbated the impact of COVID-19 in countries, subject to American aggression? And how has, the international legal framework contributed to this?
Well, look, frankly, Samir, COVID-19 only made things worse, okay? Because let's take Iran, for instance. What has Iran done? Iran has not tested nuclear weapons. India has. Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India is not a signatory. Iran has a nuclear power project, okay? India has an openly declared nuclear weapons project, and yet India has a strategic relationship with the United States. United States has helped India get uranium through the nuclear suppliers group. And Iran has been under breathtaking levels of sanctions. I mean, come on. Let's just take a deep breath and see that this is all politics, okay? It's bogus. Iran has struggled. Its health system has struggled. You see, look at how this works. The sanctions that the United States, the primary and secondary sanctions, and now we're talking about tertiary sanctions, I'll come back to that, that are in place, have been in place against Iran for now 20 years almost, okay? And some go back even to 1980. These sanctions impact the Iranian government more than Iranian private companies. Iranian private companies can do a lot of things, much more latitude. That means if you have a public health system, you are screwed. If you have privatized healthcare, it's a lot easier because private hospitals can, they can apply for things or buy things. Not easy, by the way. I don't want to say it's easy. It's hard for them. But this is not only an attack on Iran, it was an attack on Iran's public healthcare system. And Iran, before the pandemic, was in such bad shape that the health minister, Dr. Marandi, wrote a letter to the United Nations, which is so moving that I recommend people try to find it and read it. In fact, I'll try to circulate it. It's so moving because he's talking about the details. People can't get shots for various things. I was in Venezuela. Well, I'm often in Venezuela, but when I was there in, I suppose, January of 2019, I met a woman. I interviewed a woman who told me her daughter could not get her insulin injections, couldn't get the insulin. She could get the syringe, but not the insulin. And because she was a real Chavista, she decided not to leave the country and died because of that. This was before the pandemic. These sanctions are atrocious and they are a crime against international law. And the reason we call them unilateral illegal sanctions is the United States government does not have a UN Security Council resolution that would allow it to have legal sanctions against a country. These are unilateral illegal sanctions. And countries like Canada, and I'm specifically saying Canada because this platform is in Canada. Canada plays a hideous role, sometimes ahead of the United States, because over 60% of the world's mining companies are domiciled in Canada, and they would like to see the government in Venezuela overthrown. Mr. Musk, I think his name was a Monk or something, who was the head of Barrick Gold, openly wrote in the Toronto Mail or whatever, the Guardian newspaper, while Hugo Chavez was alive, calling for his overthrow. Openly, he's the head of Barrick Gold, one of the biggest mining companies in the world. These are criminals, the way they behave. Mr. Justin Trudeau is a criminal. I mean, the Lima Group is an illegal conspiracy against the government of Venezuela, an illegal conspiracy. There is no Security Council resolution or OAS resolution that allows Canada to have created the Lima Group. Why the Canadians didn't have the guts, and here Canada doesn't have the guts, why they didn't call it the Ottawa Group, I want to ask Justin Trudeau. Why were they hiding behind the government of Lima, pretending it was a South American affair, when we all know that the Lima Group was created in Ottawa and should have been called the Ottawa Group? During the pandemic, things have been difficult. Look, Venezuela is a bona fide member of the United Nations, therefore bona fide ability to get into the COVAX system, which Gopa talked about earlier. Bona fide, it has all the rights to apply for COVAX and to buy vaccines. The Venezuelan government was going to buy vaccines through COVAX and was going to pay $10 million through the UBS bank based in Switzerland. They were going to be in tranches of, I think, 4 billion, 4 billion, and 1 billion, 1 million, 1 million. Sorry, 4 million, 4 million, 1 million, 1 million. When Venezuela authorized UBS to pay COVAX, UBS blocked the payment, would not permit it. Now, I want you to think about something. What was Venezuela buying? Venezuela was buying vaccinations against the COVID-19 pandemic, and US sanctions prevented Venezuela from paying money to the COVAX public facility, so-called public facility, because they had to go through a bank like UBS, too scared to buck US sanctions, and therefore they could not buy vaccines. Now you tell me whether that is a legitimate thing. United States keeps saying, well, there are medical exceptions. Not so. The sanctions prevent secondary countries and companies who don't want to run afoul of the US Treasury Department's OFAC facility. They don't want to run foul of it. So they just, in order not to test the waters, they just don't do business with Venezuela. So Venezuela could not pay for the vaccines. And thank God for the solidarity between Cuba and Venezuela. Zero solidarity from Canada, by the way, just to keep mentioning that. Let's talk about Cuba. I'll give you another example, Samir. I know we want to move on, but I'll just give you another example. Cuba purchased masks and so on. And this is actually a better example. Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire, decided to send a plane load of masks and sanitizer, not vaccines, mind you. This is masks and sanitizer to Cuba in an act of international solidarity. It was a major thing during the early period of the pandemic. The Cubans just didn't have the material to make hand sanitizer. Many of the chemicals couldn't get into the country. Okay, so Jack Ma chartered a Colombian plane from Colombia. The problem was the Colombian plane refused to fly because one of their investors is a US bank. Now you tell me what kind of planet we live on. Meanwhile, over 2,000 Cuban doctors are all around the world, principally in the Caribbean, treating people in COVID hot wards like my friend Jani. Cuba is a socialist internationalist country, a project of socialist internationalism. Canada, the United States, these are imperialist countries. You give me a better set of explanations for why the United States is preventing Venezuela from buying vaccines. You give me a better explanation why the United States prevents Cuba from getting access to masks donated by a Chinese billionaire. You give me a better explanation, and I'll use a lighter term. I won't use a term like imperialism. Help me understand the world in a different way, and I'll agree with you. But until you do, this is the only way I have to explain what's going on.
Thank you for that explanation. And I'm glad you also brought up Venezuela, because this is a great example of how they specifically target the public sector, and then the left attacks these countries as being regressing to capitalism and being revisionist and whatnot. And so now we wanted to bring up, I guess, kind of a broad question, and we wanted to ask both of you. Maybe Vijay, you want to start, or up to you. What would be the alternative strategies that would meaningfully address vaccine inequality in the current system? I know that you've both kind of touched on this, but happy to have your thoughts on that.
Well, look, I work for a research institute, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We are a partner of the International People's Assembly, which is a network of 200 political organizations. And, we believe very much that in this period, material solidarity is essential. So we raised funds around the world. We sent a shipment of aid to Cuba directly. You may remember, after the attempt to overthrow the Cuban government on the 11th of July, the government of Bolivia sent 2 aircraft of aid to Cuba. The government of Mexico sent 2 ships to Cuba. The government of Nicaragua, poor country, sent a ship bearing the name Augusto Sandino, the great hero of Nicaraguan freedom, to Cuba. The Chinese sent a shipment of aid to Cuba. The Russians sent 2 plane loads of aid to Cuba. Material solidarity is imperative. It would be amazing if the Anti-Imperialist Alliance in Canada assembled, were in touch with the Cuba solidarity groups and assembled things to send to Cuba. And partly to do it as a campaign to raise awareness about what's happening. That's one thing. On the second point, in terms of vaccine apartheid, I remember reading, and I might be wrong, that Canada had 5 vaccines per Canadian or something like that. They'd been hoarding a large number, and these vaccines go bad. I think there should be pressure on the government of Justin Trudeau, and I don't know what the NDP and other so-called opposition forces are doing in Canada, but there needs to be pressure to donate far more money and hoarded vaccines into the various platforms that are available. But more than anything, it's not a question of donation. The pressure needs to be brought against the patent regime. That's the fundamental issue. I don't think Gopa and I are talking merely about, the COVID-19 vaccine. We're talking about the patent regime. You have to build a campaign in Canada against patent apartheid. You have to build that campaign. That's the real issue here, guys. Because it's not just about this vaccine. It's not even just about pharmaceuticals. It's about green technology, for instance. What's the point of talking about 1.5 degrees, without saying let's lift the patents on a range of different energy sources and so on and allow people to produce them? It's not just pharma. It's not just COVID. It's a range of different things that humanity require. So you have to build a campaign in Canada, against patent apartheid, or maybe a better term than that. I don't know, Gopa, that's not a great term, but against patent apartheid.
Yep. Thank you. Before Gopa speaks on the same question, I just want to reiterate that if people who have questions would be able to send them in via the Q&A function, and then we'd be able to ask them. And yeah, Gopa, floor is yours.
I think, to take it from what, Vijay told us, there is a inequitable access, and inequitable access is primarily due to the concentration of production in a few geographical areas. So the idea is you need to really scale up the production through diversification of manufacturing base. So that's what common sense tells you. But that's not the way EU, including Canada, thinks. You might have heard about something called Ottawa Group. Okay, this is a set of around 54 countries. They sat and they decided to propose a proposal, put up a proposal in WTO. So now it is called as Walker process or Walker proposal. This basically using the pandemic to further liberalize the trade and also alter the organizational governance or governance mechanisms of WTO. So this is supposed to be, come up for the this ministerial, but it was postponed. But still, this proposal can be adopted through a negotiation by the General Council. So I'll tell you two examples of this. For example, it says that the biggest problem for inequitable access is that many countries are having high tariffs. So you have to eliminate tariff or reduce tariff. Okay. So what will be the consequence of reduction of tariff? Okay. There won't be any more local production in those countries. Whatever is left related to any health products will be wiped out. So you are creating further dependency. You are using a crisis to push your agenda of trade liberalization. So this is the issue. And second, they're saying it's a pandemic is a big issue. WTO needs to respond. Therefore, WTO needs to consult with the stakeholders. All of us know that what do you mean by stakeholders, right? The Marrakesh Agreement uses the word non-governmental organizations. That means, okay, you can have these Chamber of Commerce consultations. But now here, the moment you use the word multi-stakeholder or stakeholders, that clearly gives a mandate to directly negotiate with companies. So you are bringing in international governance system, the private sector has no role actually, theoretically speaking, at least, or legally speaking. But you are now legitimizing, you are seeking a mandate to WTO Secretariat to have direct link with the private companies. So therefore, we, what we think and what these guys are thinking is in an exact opposite direction. And the alternative is to, first of all, we should challenge these mechanisms or institutions which are reinforcing concentration and monopoly, that especially intellectual property rights. So I'll tell you one more sentence and stop it, okay? To set up a production or set up a manufacturing, all of us know that it is not easy, but you need machinery, capital, and many other things. But still, our governments have policy space to address most of these issues, okay? There is a considerable loss of policy space, but still there. But when it comes to intellectual property rights, you don't have, because you surrendered your policy space by joining WTO. because of the agreement, TRIPS agreement. So therefore, we need to challenge these things, and we need to bring back the policy space required to produce health products, not only COVID vaccines, many other products, because until and unless you do not have a functional health system and access to the health products, you won't be able to manage any more pandemic or any more health crisis. So you need a robust health system, and you need to reimagine the health products as a public good. So this is what we should do.
Thank you, Gopa. It definitely seems like if for people who are not paying attention as close, they're not familiar with these institutions, there's often a lot of the multilateral system has become very ideologically shaped in terms of becoming in terms of how it reinforces this sort of unequal system. And I think that that's something that I hope, I know for me was quite valuable to learn about, and I hope others have found that enlightening. Now we're going to turn to our audience Q&A period. And kind of along the lines of like that last question, I know we were, had a question from Ethan where he was asking, I'll read it directly. My question is, what can we as ordinary people do, including people within imperial core areas, to deal with the problem of this scale? How can we contribute to socialist internationalism? And, Gopa, maybe you want to take this one first?
No.
Oh, Vijay.
I mean, look, the fact is, Ethan, like all of us, you have to be involved in something. You can't contribute without being involved. So I don't know, Samir, if Ethan is a member of your alliance, but you should join the alliance, get involved in the alliance. Many years ago, I was at some sort of socialist conference, and it's the first time I'd come up with that question. Somebody said to me, well, how do I get involved? And I said, are you a member of anything? You can't get involved by yourself. You got to join. And let me tell you, I've been in a communist party for 30 years. It's tough work. You have to deal with people you don't agree with. You have to fight for a certain position, and it's not easy. I mean, it's not fun. Okay, I mean, I'm a great aficionado of music and all kinds of things. Sometimes I regret becoming a political correspondent for the Hindu and so on. I wish I was writing in the music page, going to music shows and all that. You got to get involved, and getting involved is ugly. It takes time. You have to sacrifice something. We can't change the world unless we're involved. That's the main thing. We can't change the world by contributing in a distant way. You got to be in there. You got to get your feet dirty. And I learned that many years ago, and I can tell you it's the only answer I have for you. I don't have any direct statement, but just that.
That's a good thing, and definitely, reach out and join us if you're on the fence, anyone watching. Gopa? Well, I mean,
I completely agree. You have to dirty your hands, and you have to work. But wherever you are, you don't have to be in a whichever field you are, you should involve collectively, wherever, even labor movement or even academic rights, critically right, or even a journalist. Vijay mentioned about Chakravarti Raghavan. He was a journalist, but now if you look at now, I mean, that generation, I think I was in the last set of that link. We were studying, and we got his book, Recolonization. And I was reading this, after his death, and when whatever he has written on patent still relevant. It was exactly the same thing playing out in front of us. That time it was like, some of them are like, this may happen. So people would have dismissed like, oh, it's alarmist. But you have to. And with that, I think we should have a framework, right? We should have a vision. That worldview informs us wherever we go and whatever you do work. Even if you're working in fashion, you will look at who controls it, whether there is a concentration and who benefits it. And so all those things you can figure it out. So yeah, I fully agree.
By the way, Gopa, I put my obituary for.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah,
I put it in the chat in case people want to know
yeah.
about this nutcase we are talking about. My God, I used to come to his when I used to go for meetings at UNCTAD. I think I was one of the few people that reported UNCTAD meetings, and I would go and see him and his wife Kalyani after the meeting. And sometimes I used to stop and have a drink and so on the way there. And he'd be like, because you see, he was a vegetarian and alcohol. It's sit down over there, far from me, so your fumes don't bother me. But man, then he would just tell you in 10 minutes, he would just break everything down and say, these are the things that are happening. Because he understood what happens behind closed doors, guys. This is the key thing, that we think we live in a democratic world order. Actually, a lot of decision making happens behind closed doors. I'll give you a quick example of this. When the US government couldn't dominate the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, they tried to do the same thing through the customs union, to use police officers who were like Indian customs officers, South African, to train them to crack down on piracy. But there was no international consensus. They were trying to administer something for which there was no legal authority. They were trying to do it in the name of law and order. So this was all done behind the scenes. To have broken that story took a lot of fussing about to see what they were up to. And here I have to tell you, we live in a world where things look like conspiracies because they are conspiracies, and they turn around and tell us you're a conspiracy theorist nutcase. Good God, you fellows are doing the conspiracies, and then when we reveal them, you say that we are the ones who are mad. Come off it. Come off it.
Last one more sentence. When we say about imperialism and intellectual property rights, end of the day, it was the use of a sanction, of sanction, which forced Brazil and India to basically agree. I mean, there are some more details which we don't want to enter into. People can contest that if you go into details, but it's very clear. Okay, it is, what is a fundamental principle of any contract? There should be a consensus between both parties. There was nothing. There is a use of force or threat of use of force, right? That makes, in a domestic contract, that makes the contract null and void. But now we are all being governed through a contract which is null and void, actually.
Oh yeah, these are really important, I think, points that can kind of get disappeared when this is just kind of a status quo that we come up in. Gopa, I know you mentioned, you spoke a bit about COVAX, the COVAX mechanism, and Gavi and that whole kind of infrastructure. Rory here was asking if there's a percentage comparison that we know for the vaccine distribution worldwide. And do we know how much of this has come from your Western your countries, whether the UK or the United States or France, versus from China or Cuba? Because this is something the media doesn't really talk about here.
I think the COVAX, the initial promise was to provide 2 billion doses by end of 2020. Or then it's the deadline were extended up to 2021 June. Then, but till now they have not able to deliver even around 20 or 25% of what exactly promised. Okay, and what's the reason? The reason is that they have not used their marketing, their collective bargaining power to force the companies to diversify the production. They were depending on a few companies, and these companies are not in a position to supply after some point of time. And second, most of this vaccine is supplied from India, actually, in the COVAX, and also from China. These vaccines through the facility. And India, that in May to July, there was a complete export ban because of the surge in India. So all these all this happened because all these mechanisms were developed without taking into consideration of the WHO members' viewpoints. Why? Because this is a multi-stakeholder mechanism where all members countries are not part of the decision making. It is donor driven, and it is also not accountable to anyone. for that matter. It's basically, you will see they have created two mechanisms: ACT or ACTA, access to COVID technology, acceleration of COVID technology access, and COVAX facility. There are a few actors are there in the both place, and Gates Foundation is one of the important actor. Okay, and the ACTA is emerged out of a white paper produced by Gates Foundation. So these are important points we should keep in mind, and this is what is going to happen when we give the decision-making powers to a multi-stakeholder framework. So that's why it is failed. Actually, this mechanism, instead of creating this kind of mechanism, they should have also use their purchasing power normally to shift the policies of the companies, and also the developed countries should have allowed, first of all, they should have followed that, okay, we agreed through a multilateral mechanism, we agreed for a global allocation through a WHO resolution. This is adopted because of there is a General Assembly resolution for ensuring equitable access. Then they should have followed this. Instead of following that, they try to play what you call vaccine nationalism. Okay, we will protect our people, then only we will think about others. That created the problem.
Thank you. That's a great just summary to this the way that this has kind of come about, and I think builds nicely on what has been discussed up to this point. I'm also glad that you brought up the Gates Foundation. Joe here was asking about like the media role here, that is like, are they, he was asking specifically, are they aware of kind of this, because like, this is not something that comes across like in much of the media coverage at all, like even as they're worrying about, like they're reporting on the lack of vaccinations in Africa or in other countries. They don't seem to really drill into why the system is set up this way and how it reinforces and creates, like, as you put, like this network effect, right? That is moving the system in this direction towards, like private monopoly control. I don't know, maybe I'm happy for whoever feels like they want to talk on this, but I thought maybe Vijay, if you can speak on, because I know the Gates Foundation has invested a lot into media, for example, like at least.
Firstly, I would like to say that public pressure can work, and plays a role. And I know, I mean, I don't know altogether that much about Canadian politics, but I know that, for instance, it was helpful to have people like Nikki Ashton and so on take up the cause of the Bolivian government against the Canadian government to get the clearance for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. For almost, I think, 8-9 months, Trudeau's government prevented Johnson & Johnson from selling a low-dose variety of its vaccine to BioLease, I think is the name of the Bolivian platform. And I mean, it was helpful to have people like Nikki Ashton and so on come out there in public and hammer on this. And I must say, credit where credit is due, guys, frankly, because it's important that this clearance took place, because you need to now build on this clearance, But how did the media report it? That's interesting. I don't know. I don't follow the Canadian press, but I wonder how the media reported. I want to say a few things about the media. One is, yes, it's true. There is a corporate capture of the media increasingly. Increasing space for free media is disappearing. Look, I just worked with 26 research institutes from around the world to create something called a plan to save the planet. We did this under the collaboration with ALBA TCP. Secretary General Sasha Laurenti, who was the Bolivian ambassador to the UN. Sasha is now the Secretary General of ALBA TCP. We produced this beautiful plan. I urge you to go to thetricontinental.org, download it. It's in Spanish, Portuguese, English. You can take a read, Italian, Arabic, French. It's in a whole bunch of languages. It's a super document, okay? It's only about 20 odd pages. Anyway, I wrote to the Guardian newspaper in the UK and I said, Sasha Laurenti, he's the head of a trade alliance of 9 countries. He and I are writing an article. Would the Guardian be interested? And the editor wrote me back, within hours, said, not at this point. It's not what we're looking for, or something like that. I decided to go to the Guardian page, on the opinion page, and it's basically all, well, I don't want to say what it is because they are also legitimate people allowed to write. But it's so interesting. Out of hand, they dismissed two people who wanted to write about this based on a report produced by 26 research institutes from Kerala, from Cuba, from, we all work together across languages to produce this text. It's not easy. Just for that, it's worth the story, that we basically non-governmental research institutes work together from Lebanon, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa. It's a feat that we produce this vision for the planet after COVID-19, trying to contest the World Economic Forum. There'll be no press coverage. So on the one hand, yes, there's corporate capture. Secondly, the journalists themselves have a lack of experience and exposure to revolutionary processes or social movements. They don't know how to cover them because they've never been involved in them. That's the difference between, again, I'm sorry to bring, but now we have him on the table. Raghavan was actually involved because he was in he got expelled from India essentially. Mrs. Gandhi wanted him fired from the press trust. He ran afoul of Mrs. Gandhi. He understood politics. He understood the limits of what can happen, how power can smash you with a hammer. Many journalists today don't understand what social movements are. They don't understand what a project is like the Cuban project or the Venezuela. They simply don't understand. So they accept the terms set by bourgeois governments that will say, oh, Venezuela, they are authoritarian. Nicolas Maduro, he's a dictator, whatever. They accept the terms of these things. They don't understand Venezuela. Firstly, they don't understand a country like Venezuela. And I admit, it's not easy to understand a Caribbean country. But they don't. There is a kind of racism involved. Nicolas Maduro was a bus driver. There is a class hatred involved here. He's a bus driver. He's the uncouth guy as far as they are concerned. He didn't go to Cambridge or wherever, Eton, like Boris Johnson. They can behave like barbarians, bomb countries. George W. Bush can bomb and destroy Iraq. Nobody ever questions his bona fides, But somehow they'll question the bona fides of Nicolas Maduro. He's this, he's that. He's put people in jail. Per capita, no country has as many people in jail as the United States, okay? You want to talk about an authoritarian country, it's the United States. There's any problem, they throw you in jail. Per capita, largest imprisoned population in the United States. Not in Venezuela, not in Cuba, not even in North Korea, guys. Not even in North Korea, okay? The highest per capita jailed is in the US. Let's face it, let's face that Canada is built on the genocide of native people. Let's face that. You're calling, Gaddafi genocidaire? What about your bloody own history of genocide? It's right there baked into the cake of your constitution. You're still under the rule of the British Empire. At least we can say in India we threw the British out. You're still respecting the Queen and whatever, wanting to make actually Prince, that fellow who got stuck with Erickson or whatever his name is, the pedophile, Prince Andrew. In the 1980s, there was a talk to make Prince Andrew the King of Canada. Okay, let's face where you are. Talk about authoritarian, pointing fingers at other countries. So part of it is journalists just don't know how to report these stories. I've talked to journalists for years, they wouldn't accept that what was happening in Bolivia in 2019 is a coup. They wouldn't accept it. It's a play. Right now, there's an ongoing coup in Solomon Islands. I bet you don't know about it even because it's not covered because, it's irrelevant. Australian troops have landed in the capital city in Solomon Islands, There's just a coup happening in plain sight, but because the US and Australia are engineering the coup, it's okay, not a problem. Come on.
No, thank you for that. That's a great point. And yeah, I've only seen a little bit of news about that, and not any kind of coverage in CBC or any of the main papers here. And in the case of Bolivia, the New York Times only meekly after the fact admitted that that was a coup. At the time, they were like it wasn't. Oh, well, sorry, I muted myself. So we appreciate all the insights and that you provided us here at AIA and all our attendees at this panel on the structures and workings of imperialism and of this vaccine apartheid and just this neoliberal kind of neo-colonialism that we're dealing with. we'd want to actually now, I guess, bring the audience portion of this to a close and move towards the video that that we got from Dr. Davide. Would Sean, would you be able to play that now? But we want to once again just thank you again.
Thank you, Samir. Yes, we'll be playing the video in a few moments.
Yeah, I'm gonna play it now.
Well, okay, good morning, everybody. And I have been requested to have a conversation with you about the Cuba fight to COVID-19, to coronavirus pandemics. Well, I have collected some slides and data. Numbers, because it is very good to start always with figures, numbers. And you see here some comparison of the world average and the data of some countries, and you can see in red below that figures corresponding to Cuba are not that bad. In fact, they are better than many other countries, even rich countries. And it's not a matter of comparison for the sake of comparison, but just to show you that the performing of the strategy that Cuba have developed for fighting COVID is producing results. I also know that people are very interested and focused in vaccine, but it is not good to focus exclusively in vaccine, because the result of the fighting of COVID in Cuba is not just a consequence of the vaccine. In fact, it's a multi-component strategy, and having mainly these 4 components that you have here in that slide. So first, the participation of the society, information policy, participation of all the people in that, work of the local government and so on. The second component is the public health system, that in Cuba, as you know, is 100% coverage of free public health. And inside the public health system is the primary care that is rather well developed since many decades ago. And then the other component is the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry, and I will focus on that because, well, what is less known is that the biotechnology industry is part of the strategy of the country for fighting coronavirus. So these are the 4 components. Just to show this, maybe other colleagues can talk about the other component, but I will focus now on the 4th one. What is the role of biopharmaceutical industry? And this is what is the biopharmaceutical industry in Cuba. No? Right now there are 32 enterprises, that companies that have 80 production lines and more than 20,000 employees. So it's a rather big industry that have been created since the 80s. So the very first of these facilities are in the early 80s. It's rather early, in fact, because biotechnology is not at all worldwide. And it should be noticed that this effort of building a biotechnology industry since almost 40 years ago, is the basis on which we can construct now a strategy for fighting COVID. So all this existed before, well before COVID, and including manufacturing capacity. And it should be said that these institutions that you see here have been built in the 80s according to a concept of a closed loop facility. Closed loop means organization that perform research and manufacturing and even marketing and export. So it's an integrated facility, each one of them. And it's not just the research institute as classically considered. So these centers include good manufacturing practices and scale-up manufacturing capacity and export right now. Not right now, export since many years ago to more than 40 countries. So you see here the pipeline and note that vaccine is 32% of the pipeline. So it is a pharmaceutical industry that gives to vaccine and to prevention a protagonic role. It's not the same in many multinational companies worldwide, because pharmaceutical company, private pharmaceutical company that have been operated in many countries, market-driven, so have been moving away for the vaccine, because what is more profitable is pills for chronic non-communicable diseases. But in our context, vaccines has always been a priority of Cuban biopharmaceutical industry. Now there are more than 100 projects. You see the distribution there. 32% are vaccine, but then we also have cytokines, interferon, monoclonal antibodies, and so on. So, by the way, there is a joint Cuba-Canada story in monoclonal antibodies, because we have been cooperated in that since many years ago, and in fact we had a joint venture company, Cuban-Canadian joint venture company operated in Ontario for more than 10 years. And there were clinical trials for monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of cancers going on in Canada. So there are roots of Cuban-Canadian cooperation before COVID. So, and in what concerns vaccine, so vaccination rates in Cuba, as confirmed by UNICEF and UNESCO, it's not our data, it's international organization data, is over 99% against 13 diseases. And 8 of these vaccines are manufactured here in the country. No, not a single case of measles since 1993. And meningitis B epidemics in the 80s was stopped by an innovative Cuban vaccine. There is a story of cooperation between WHO and Cuba for vaccination in other countries. And in fact, the Bloomberg report in 2019 ranked Cuba among the healthiest country in the world. So this is a story that should be said not for bragging here, but just to create a basis of knowledge on top of which we are going to talk about coronavirus. So these are the vaccines, anti-infectious vaccines that are part of the Cuban vaccination program for the childhood. And well, this is the story of diseases that were eliminated. There are many diseases that do not exist anymore because of the vaccine coverage. And this is the story of meningitis B that should be highlighted, because in the 80s we have an outbreak of meningitis B, and at the time there was no vaccine in the world available for meningitis B. There were vaccines for meningitis A and C, but not B. And the very first vaccine in the world was developed by Finland Institute in Cuba. And you see here what happened with the epidemics. They was completely stopped by vaccination. This is an important result that we are very proud of. And I used to tell in class to my students that you can work 20 years in your life just to see this picture for 20 minutes. So it's good to see that how vaccination works. And in this case, I repeat, vaccination is not the consequence of just purchasing an existing vaccine or what, but inventing a vaccine that did not exist at the time. And this is the story of meningitis B. This is the story of hepatitis B. Hepatitis B vaccine is a recombinant vaccine. So it's a high technology vaccine. And you see the 3 lines that you see in the pictures corresponds to the incidence of hepatitis B below 15 years old, below 5, and in the whole population. And you see that the disease is disappearing. And this is another consequence of the vaccine. And this is a Haemophilus influenza vaccine. And this is also a Canadian connection, because there were joint research between Cuba and Canada for Ottawa University, I think, that participated in the research previous to the manufacturing of the vaccine. And you see what happened with the incidence of meningitis, not meningococcus meningitis, but in that case meningitis produced by Haemophilus influenza. By the way, this is the very first vaccine in the world that is completely synthetic. No, it's not the microbe growing in the fermenter. It's a chemical synthesis of carbohydrate that produces that vaccine, and the vaccine produces this result that you see that. So it should be noted that this is not a clinical trial. This is a whole population data, so the complete incidence in the country. And in fact, Nature, that is a prestigious journal that everybody knows, well, qualified biotechnology in Cuba as the most established biotechnology industry in the developing world, in an editorial describing the evolution of biotechnology in Cuba. So it is normal then that having this basis, so that once the epidemics of coronavirus disease started, so this force, this research and manufacturing force were mobilized for fighting COVID. And you see that in BioCuba Pharma, that I forget to mention, BioCuba Pharma is the name of the group of industry of the pharmaceutical industry and biotechnology. It's like a holding organization of these enterprises. And in BioCuba Pharma, there are now 27 projects related to fighting COVID. So you see immunomodulators, antiviral, anti-inflammatories, preventive vaccine, diagnostic, even medical equipment. So, and 18 of these of the products emerging from this research project have already emergency authorization by the Cuban regulatory authority, and 22 of these products are now in the phase of scaling up manufacturing. So you see some of them here. So interferon existed well, in the world many years ago, but Cuba started manufacturing interferon in '81, and then alpha interferon, and then gamma interferon, and then the combination of alpha plus gamma, and these products were used for early stages of the coronavirus disease. Then it comes biomodulina. Biomodulina is a peptide, a group of peptides derived from thymus that produce a stimulation of the immune system. Then we have the monoclonal antibodies. In fact, there are two monoclonal antibodies. In the picture you have just one. The monoclonal antibody that appear in the picture is an antibody against EGF, against epidermal growth factor, that we had developed in the 90s for cancer. But it seems now, according to the knowledge that have been produced in the research of COVID, that epidermal growth factor have a role in the physiopathology of COVID, and we are using that for severe cases. So, and then Husbinza is also a peptide that was developed for autoimmune diseases and has been redirected now for using COVID. This is called, in pharmaceutical industry, this idea is called reprofiling. So you have a product, you have data, the product is safe, but you have data for other disease, and then you evaluate if the product can also be used in this new disease. In this product, this was exactly the case. Then there are some of the Cuban biotechnology companies have a branch also manufacturing machines, equipment, and we are producing now ventilation equipment, one rather simple for non-invasive ventilation, and another one that is a high-performance lung ventilator. Of course, we have also machines like that have been imported. Some of them have been sent to Cuba thanks to the work of a Solidarity organization. But we have also our own project for manufacturing these vaccines. And then we go to the point of the vaccines. There are 5 vaccines here. No? 3 of them, so that we call Soberana 1, Soberana 2, Soberana 1, Soberana 2, and Abdala have received authorization of the Cuban Regulatory Authority. The other two are in clinical research right now, and we have started vaccinations with our own vaccines, no? And up to now, and these figures are from yesterday, I updated yesterday the figure. So 17 million doses have been given to volunteers. 70% of the population in Cuba have received the first vaccination, and 40% of the population has already received the 3-dose plus 14 days of maturation of the immune response, and we can consider it vaccinated. And the campaign continues. You see the kinetics of vaccination in Cuba. So looking brown, the slope of the Cuban vaccination intensity as compared with US. And of course, in the US, they started first. They started in December 2020. We started later on. We started in July, June, July this year. But once we started, the intensity has been very fast, and some international databases consider the Cuban vaccination program of having now the highest intensity of vaccination per million inhabitants and per day, no, in the world. So then something should be said about the embargo, because all this effort is carried on in the framework of the economic hostility of the government of the United States, an hostility that has been kept intact even in the middle of the pandemics. Something that someday the mankind should judge that from a moral viewpoint. So. But you can see what their documents say. So the Cuban Democracy Act for 9 of the United States government and legislation bodies come from 1992. So, and it says, well, that export of medical supplies, instrument, and equipment to Cuba cannot be restricted. This is simply not true. So we have a tremendous evidence, or a long list of evidence of the embargo stopping the export of medical supply to Cuba. But moreover, no, the very same document says that there is an exception, except in the case in which the item to be exported could be used for the production of any biotechnology product. So in that case, no, the export to Cuba is restricted by law, and you can see that this clause of the exception for biotechnology products include vaccines. So specifically and explicitly, the legislation approved by the U.S. government forbids the export to Cuba of product to be used for manufacturing vaccines. So how to consider that, how to evaluate that, how to judge that from an ethic point of view. So well, I leave you with the question for you to answer. So finally, well, that's it, no? And I leave you my email here in case that any one of the audience can send a question. I will be more than happy to answer, or to connect you with the people that can answer any specific questions. Thank you very much.
Just wow. It's truly amazing to see what Cuba has managed to accomplish despite the just even pre-pandemic just the boot of American imperialism and Western imperialism on its neck. And especially, the point about the just intensity of the vaccination campaigns that they've been able to undertake. But I hope that people found that video enlightening and useful. And yeah, if you have questions, I encourage you to even contact the doctor himself. But with that, which brings our session to a close. But before so, I'd just like to, in closing, say that thank you to all our comrades for attending, and especially thank you to, of course, the doctor, but Davide, as well as our two panelists who were able to join us here live. Vijay, thank you, and Gopa, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you all do, of course, as well. In just bringing these issues to light and fighting, the good fight in all these international institutions and across the world. And yeah, we definitely are inspired, and we hope that everyone else has been inspired, and that we, redouble our efforts and feel that, yeah, that the struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, will not stop here. And long live international solidarity, and long live the freedom struggle. Thank you.
Beautifully said. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gopa, and thank you, Vijay, for joining us.